In this lab, we're going to look at security, but before we do that, before we look at security, there's two things that we want to preface with on the security. The first thing is, in this database, we have a patient record or a patient table. And if I right-click, I can take a look at those records. So here's a bunch of patients in my database. But we don't want users to simply be able to delete patients from these records, because if they delete patients from these records, then it's going to delete all the other study information about these patients. So even though they may drop out of the study and we don't want them to be available any longer, and we want to prevent people from using them, we don't want to just delete them from the database. So in this particular database, the designers chose to use a dropped patient table. And if you look at this table, it simply tells you the patient key, the date they were dropped, and the reason that they were dropped. So when you do a deletion from the patient table, rather than deleting the patient, instead we want to drop the patient. So the question becomes, how do we insert the patient rather than allow a delete on patient? So the way to do that, we're going to go into patient and create a trigger. So a trigger can run instead of something else or after something happens. So it can be run after a delete, it could be run after an insert or an update, and likewise it could be run before an insert or an update. So we're going to go in here and click on New Trigger. Now normally you could just click on New Trigger. I'm going to delete all this because I don't really need it. But we are going to create a trigger that's going to do something after delete. So rather than deleting a record, so after a delete, rather than deleting the record, we simply want to do something else with that record. And I think we don't want after delete. We're actually going to want before delete. Let's see if that works. So let me just explain what this trigger is going to do. And you'll need this trigger on your database as well. So when the trigger is run after delete, it's going to take the value from patient. It's creating a variable called patient, and it's going to set that variable using the patient key from the deleted table. Deleted is a special table name. There's two special tables you can use in a trigger. One is inserted, and the other one is deleted. Inserted is the data that was added to a table, and deleted is the old data. So if you're doing an update, the deleted table contains the values from before the update, whereas insert is the values after the update. So in this case, we're going to get the patient key first from the deleted. So we're going to see which patient are they trying to delete. And then we're going to insert into the dropped patient table the patient's key, the date they were dropped, and the reason they were dropped. So the patient key is going to be that variable, patient. Get date is going to be the current date and time, so we know when it happened. And then we're just going to put a static value in for the reason that it was deleted. So now if I execute this, it ran. So now if I attempt to delete a patient, let's see if it writes it to the dropped patient table. So we're going to do select top 1,000 rows. We have no patients in here at this time. So let's delete from patient, where patient key, and I'm going to do 2-8. So I'm going to delete patient 2-8. Now before I run that, I'm always going to go up here and make sure, if I don't declare my database, I have to select the database. I'm going to highlight just to run that one statement. So let's see what happens. All right, so it ran, and it affected two tables. It obviously deleted from patient, but it should have inserted our patient key. So there it is. It automatically inserted this record. But it also deleted the record from the patient table. So we would want to modify this trigger to either prevent it from deleting from the other table, or to go ahead and write the values from deleted back into that table. So what I could do is I could just add in here an insert statement. So insert into patient, and I could just reinsert all of those records. So that's certainly one way to do it. So let's move on to the next step. After we write our trigger, another element for databases that affects security, which we're going to talk about in this lab, is views. So basically, a view allows you to take a query that's maybe moderately complex or something like that, and to give it a different name as sort of a fake table. And it's just materialized when somebody calls that view as if they're selecting from a table. So for example, let's say I wanted to select the last names and the groups, right? So for example, we have patients. So we have a list of patients, and we also have the groups to which they're assigned. And what's in common between these two tables is, for example, the patient group assignment, we have a patient key, which relates back to the patient key in the patient table. So if I do this, if I did select star from, and I'm just going to click and drag from patient, I can join, and I'm going to join patient group assignments. Now here's the thing, I don't want to type out these patient or these table names each time, so I'm going to give them an alias. So I've typed that single letter after each one just to give it an alias. It doesn't have to be a single letter, I just find it's easier that way. So I'm going to join patient on the patient key equals the assignment on patient key. So I'm telling SQL to connect these two tables together on the patient key. So when I run that, now I get a list of all my patients, but I also see the group key. It's a little bit confusing, I think, to see all these records when all I really care about is a few things. So I'm going to just show the last name of my patient and the group key. Now that's pretty good, except one problem, no one's going to know what these group keys mean. So I usually want to show the actual group they're in. So I'm going to join the group table so I can see which groups they're in, because the groups table contains the group's description. Again, I'll alias it, and we'll do group key, and the group key is going to connect to the assignment table on the group key as well. Now, instead of doing the group key, I can show group description. Let's see if that works. There we go. So now I see the last names and the description of the group. So let's do one more thing. Now we're going to create a view. I'm going to create view. I'm going to prefix it with VW, patient groups, as. I'm going to run that. It's done. Now if I go over here to views and refresh, I've got a new view. And if I right click, just like any other table, so I'm going to click select top 1000 rows. It works just like any other table. So I have now a table that just contains the last name and the group description. And of course, this is dynamic. If I make any changes to my patients, these are going to dynamically update. So if I change the last name or if I move somebody to a different group, it's all going to be in this view. All right, so let's move on to the next step. So I've cleared my screen. Now we're going to talk a little bit about security. So when we look at security, there are, and if you recall from our lecture, there are two places that we have users, or that we can find user names, but really, they're kind of a little bit different. So you've got two tabs for security. So notice under my Westlake database, I have a security tab, and it has users, but then under security, I have logins. So if you recall, a user for a database cannot actually log in unless they have a login account. So users are simply connected to logins. So you log into the database using your login account, and then your login account is connected to user accounts within databases. And one thing that's interesting is you don't have to have the same username and login ID. They can be different. So you can have a login ID that connects you to a user in a database, and they don't necessarily have to be the same, which is what we're going to try to do here. So let's take a look at how to create a user account, or a login. So first, we're going to start with creating a login for the doctors. So it's going to look like this. So create login, doctor login. I'm just using a password of p@SSW0RD, but you can choose something else if you like. So I'm going to execute that. Oh wait, before I execute that, make sure you're using the master database. So you should be set to master when you do this, not the local database. This is the one time we actually want to be in the master database. Normally, we're always making sure we're in Westlake, but this time we're going to make sure we're set to master. I'm going to execute the statement, and it runs. So now I should also be able to take or create user accounts for patients and researcher. So to do that, I'm just going to change this to patient, and then I'm going to change this to research. Okay, so now I should have 3 login accounts created. So I'm going to go over to login and refresh. There's my doctor, patient, research. So they've been created. The next step is we're going to create our actual user accounts. This is going to be a 3-step process. So let me put the code in here for you so you can see what we're going to do. So our first step is to create a role. So in this case, I'm going to create a doctor role. Then I'm going to create a user. Now before I run this, I'm going to switch to the Westlake database. And in fact, I'm going to run this again from Westlake because we want to make sure we create this role in the Westlake database. Then in the Westlake database, I'm going to create my user, and it's going to create it from the doctor login. So it's going to basically say when somebody logs in using this login, they're going to be using this user account when they connect to the Westlake database. So I'll execute that. And finally, I have to add the doctor user into this doctor role that I created in the beginning. Now, if you recall, the reason we create a role is we don't want to assign permissions directly to individual users. It's better to do it at the role level. If you have 50 people that are doctors, you don't want to have to make any changes to their user account 50 times. You would only want to do it one time to the role. So it's critical to have a role. So as a habit, whenever you're creating a new type of user, you'll create a role first, and then any additional users you create or you add, you would attach to that role. So now that we've created our user account, or our role and user for doctors, let's do the same thing for patients and for researchers. So it's really just the same command, but this time for researchers and patients. And I'm going to run those. And you can see here I've got an error here. I cannot alter the role research role because it does not exist or I don't have permission. So it's not letting me create the research role. And the chances are, the reason I can't create it is if I look under roles, I probably already have a research role. So let's refresh this. So I have a doctor role, patient role, and a research role. So I already had that role in there from when I did this earlier. So it wouldn't let me create it again. But I should be able to verify that I have my research. Well, let's take a look at our users. So I'm going to right-click and refresh on users. You can see I've got my doctor user, my patient user, and my research user. So it created all 3 of those user accounts. So now I have a login for the database engine itself. I have a user account for those 3 users, and I have a role for each of those users. Now here it's kind of hard to tell why we have a role, but remember, I could have many different users that are researchers or many different users that are doctors. So if I have 50 doctors configured as users, each one of those would be in the doctor role. And then when I affect permissions on the doctor role, it will affect all of the doctor users with just one change. So it's definitely much more convenient to use the roles. So let's move on to the next step. One thing right now, since we created these user accounts, they don't have permission to do anything. So they won't be able to, they'll be able to log in, but they won't be able to select from any tables. They won't be able to view anything. So we have to grant them permission. We have to tell the database engine what these users are allowed to do. So for example, we created earlier the patient groups view. So we created a view earlier. I could give the research role access to that view. So by granting select on this view that we created earlier to the research role, now whenever a user in the research role logs in, they should be able to select from that view. It's saying here that it can't create it because it can't find that view. So let's take a look and see if my view created. So I'm going to go into Westlake views, VW_patient. Oh, I spelled the groups wrong. GOURPS. So rather than going and changing it. Well, you know what? Let's change it. Sometimes you have to change this stuff. So let's do that. So we're going to go to alter to. So I'm going to right click script view to alter to. And actually, I don't want to alter it. I really just want to create a new one. And I'm going to spell it correctly this time. Now, when I come over here, it creates that. So now I have granted the select permission on patient groups to the research role. So now somebody who logs in with the research role, they'll be able to query that view. And you'll see now that the view is in here. I'm going to delete the one that's incorrect. Now there are other types of assignments. So for example, with my research role, maybe they're allowed to look at the research groups, but maybe I also want to allow them to add patients into a research group. So to do that, they have to be able to insert into the patient group assignment. Maybe I don't want them to be able to view that table, but they could always insert into it, or maybe they can update it. So I can grant permissions to that. So now my research role will be able to insert into patient groups assignment, and they'll be able to view what groups patients are in by using that view. They won't be able to select directly from patient, and they won't be able to select directly from the groups assignment or the groups table, but they can see the aggregation of that by using that view that I created, which is probably exactly what they want anyway. They wouldn't have a reason to go and query those other tables directly. All right, so we've been able to grant permission for users to access certain records by using views, which we talked about in the lecture, and we also granted access to insert. So at this point, you want to pause the video. You're going to log off. So what you want to do is click on this little icon right here to disconnect from the database engine. Then I want you to reconnect using the research login. So we're going to disconnect. And now I'm going to type research login and a password of capital P9 SSW0RD. That's the password that I used. And it says login failed. So see if you get the same thing. And I'm going to double check on my side and see if maybe I just put the wrong password in. So once you've logged in with that research user, you're going to try to select from just maybe the patient table and see if that works, but also try to select from the VW_patient groups, the view that we created earlier. It should fail when you try to select from patient, but it should work fine when you select from VW patient groups, the view. So go ahead and try that. Maybe troubleshoot on your own if you're having any difficulty with it. And then we're going to move on to the next step. So at this point, you want to disconnect, and then you're going to reconnect as your SA user. Now we're going to go back into our Westlake database, and we're going to create another view. So in our lab assignment, they would like us to create a view that's going to show the patients as well as the last name of the doctor. So I'm going to show you what this view looks like. So I'm creating a view called VW_Dr. Patient. It's going to have the patient from the patient table, the patient key, from the doctor table, the doctor name, and then all the rest of the patient information. And you can see I'm simply using a join to put those two tables together. So I'm joining doctor keys from both the doctor and the patient table. So I should be able to execute that command. And now I should be able to select from VW_Dr. Patient. And now you can see we have our patient key, but instead of the doctor ID, now we've got the doctor name. Okay, so that's how we create a view that shows that information. Now that we've created that view, let's grant access to that view to both the doctor role and the patient role. So just like I did before, I'm going to grant select on VW patient doctor to both the doctor and the patient role. And then we get an error. It says that VW patient doctor does not exist. And I think it's because I used a different name. So let's take a look at the view. Oh, I got it backwards, so it's going to be Dr. Patient. Let's see if it runs when we use the correct view name, and it worked. So that should have granted permission, and you can certainly log off and log back into your database and test that to see if that works. Another technique that our textbook talks about for security is using stored procedures. A stored procedure is when you have some SQL code that executes on the user's behalf. So in this case, I could create a stored procedure called getAllPatients. So when a user runs that stored procedure, it simply goes out and gets all the patients for that user. So my user doesn't select from patients. Instead, they call the stored procedure, which does this on their behalf. This is a very simple stored procedure. I'll go ahead and run it. Oop, I already have that in the database. I must have created this earlier and forgot to delete it. So let me go ahead and delete. By the way, you'll find stored procedures under Programmability, Stored Procedures. So you can see I've got a few of them in here. So I'm going to get rid of this one so you can see it get created. There we go, it worked this time. And now I can refresh my stored procedures. And it has getAllPatients. So from a security perspective, a user could, if they wanted to, execute a stored procedure rather than doing directly selecting data from the database itself, from the underlying schema. What's nice about that is, number one, it allows you to abstract the schema from the users. So if you have an application that's written a certain way, it can call the stored procedure, and then when you need to make changes in the database, you can simply abstract those changes through the stored procedure. So you can make changes to the stored procedures rather than asking an application developer to make those changes. So it's definitely an advantage from that perspective. But the other advantage from a security perspective is if users do not have direct access to those tables, it makes it much more easy to secure those tables. So by preventing that direct access and abstracting it through stored procedures and views and things like that, you can certainly help with the security for your database. As a general practice, a general rule, I generally try to make any application that I work with use stored procedures and the views to interact with the database. Even for things like inserts and updates, I'll still give them a view to do that rather than doing it directly in the database. That way we can make schema changes, we can change column names and things like that without having to worry about applications having to get rewritten, because instead we can just go in and change their views to look at the new column names. And they can still use the old column names or any column names they like for that matter. And again, from a security perspective, it is a little bit more secure, and it makes it a little bit easier to secure your table. So you can make it so that users never have access directly to tables. They have to do this through stored procedures and through views. So it certainly helps. There are two other stored procedures that your book walks you through creating. One is going to be the get my patients, and then the get doctor patients. So I'll show you the get doctor patients one first. So I'm going to right click, go to script stored procedure, create to, and I'll just make this a little simpler. We don't need this extra code up here. So this is what it would look like. You have create procedure, then the procedure name. We're going to get an argument this time. The argument is going to be the doctor key. So now instead of the user just calling get doctor patients, now they have to pass in a doctor key, and then they'll get a list of all the patients with that doctor key. So for example, I could type exec, and then I'll just drag this over, make it easier. I'll put in a doctor key. So one of my doctors is 22222. I'll run that. Oops. I forgot we're not supposed to use our parentheses here. Okay, so now we can see all of the patients for Dr. 22222, which makes sense, but what if we want the user to get the list of their patients but use their name instead of their key? So here's another stored procedure we could take a look at. And again, I'll delete all this extra junk up here. So now we have get my patients, but instead we're going to pass in the doctor name as opposed to the doctor key. So let's try to execute this. So I'm going to type exec, get my patients, and I believe Wong is one of our patients. And apparently Wong doesn't have any patients, so let's see who our other doctors are. Let's do, I guess, Dr. Smith or Jones. Let's try Jones. My apologies, I had this mixed up. When you read this code up here, it doesn't get the patients from doctor name. Instead, it gives you the doctor's name rather than the ID number. So now we get the doctor's name when we pass the doctor key instead of just regurgitating that doctor key. And of course, it does this by using the view that we created earlier. So we created that view, we kind of set the table to use that later on from the stored procedure. Although we could have done it from the stored procedure just using a join within the stored procedure as well. All right, so that's pretty much everything you'll need to do for this lab. There are questions in the book that you're going to answer that you'll turn in for the lab assignment. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.